Hello there, friends. This is Spencer Michaud, and welcome to your weekly astrology forecast for the week of June 22nd through June the 28th. This week we have a few planets that are switching direction, including Neptune stationing retrograde at 20 degrees of Pisces on the 23rd, which is Tuesday. Thursday the 25th, Venus will be stationing direct at 5 degrees of Gemini. Saturday the 27th, we will be seeing Mars moving into the first decan of Aries and hanging out in Aries for about 6 months. So we'll do a deep dive on Mars this week. And then on Sunday the 28th, we're going to be experiencing our first quarter moon with a Libra moon at 7 degrees, squaring the sun at 7 degrees of Cancer. And then Mars will be sextiling a retrograde Saturn at 0 degrees of Aries and Aquarius, respectively. Okay, I'm going to share my screen here. Actually, before I do that, I'm kind of excited. Hopefully everything goes okay. This recording this on Friday. What is the date today? June the 19th. Just as Mercury has gone retrograde, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I'm excited because my books finally came. Like, it's interesting to see that my books came that I've been eagerly anticipating. They came right as Mercury was stationing, but I got a couple cool books in the mail. One is called Hamlet's Mill that I've been hearing a lot about from Bernadette Brady's book about the fixed stars, and talking a lot about cosmoarchaeology, which is basically kind of like learning about the history of mythology through observation of the sky, which what you would think would be pretty useful for astrologers. So that's pretty neat. And like, I'm one of my missions in the next few months and years ahead here is to get more of an understanding and a connection to the sky itself. A lot of the times as astrologers, we can get kind of fixated on the two-dimensional chart that's in front of us. And I think that astrologers in history were very much experts on the motion of the sky itself and the observation of the movement of the constellations and the fixed stars and the planets. And that's something that I feel I want to improve on, because I think that we can really glean a lot of meaning from seeing the actual movement of the sky. And I think it's so important. So this book is really great about talking about how a lot of the cultural mythology was based on that visible observation of the movement of the planets and the stars and the constellations and all that. So very excited to dive into that. So I'll keep you posted as to my discoveries with that. And then I also got this cool book that is kind of like a supplement to Bernadette Brady's first book, her first book, Fixed Stars. This is star and planet combination. So this is kind of neat too, which she gives a lot of meaning with the stars and how they relate to the planetary placements. She goes further into the concept of parans versus the fixed star being conjunct a planet on a ecliptical degree. So that's another thing that I'm working through in my studies. I'm hoping to have a guest speaker on that concept towards as we get into the summer here. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But what I'm doing when I'm working with fixed stars recently, though, is working with them on the ecliptical degree. I don't feel like I have enough of a grasp of the concept of parans to incorporate that into the equation yet, but maybe that will be something for the future. From people that I've talked to, people use those fixed stars both ways. And one of the things I did want to make a correction from last week too, as I was talking about Mercury on the planet or on the fixed star of Sirius, I think I mistakenly mentioned that Sirius was the pole star. And Sirius is not the pole star. The pole star is actually named Polaris. So I wanted to make that correction because sometimes when I'm getting into the flow of things, things will bubble up, and you always want to kind of, in true Mercury retrograde fashion, you want to make the correction while you still can, right? Okay, so let's move forward. So I'm going to share my screen here. And one of the things I want to do a little bit differently this week is, instead of just telling you about the essential dignities, what I want to do is give you more of a planetary condition report. So we'll combine the essential dignities of the planet. But what I wanted to do also was make it very clear which planets are aspecting or co-present with a planet, because that makes a big difference in the Hellenistic system as to what planets are kind of giving or bearing witness and testimony to a planet. So I think that that would be a good thing to do to start off our week. And I also want to talk about which planet is hosting that particular planet, because that can also color the expression that we will be experiencing with a planet in a certain temple or domicile or area of the zodiac. So I'm going to just start with one chart here at the beginning of the week. Well, actually, let me see. Well, let's talk about the sun first. The sun is going to be moving from 7 to 11, I'm sorry, from 1 to 7 degrees. Okay, so it's starting off at 1 degree, and at the beginning of the week, it is going to be in the sign of of Cancer, the first decan of Cancer, where it is peregrine, which basically means it doesn't have essential dignity. It is in the terms of Mars from 0 to 7 degrees, and then the terms of Venus from 7 to 13 degrees. So remember, terms is a word that means bound lord or bound ruler, and that was the planet that was setting the curriculum. If you think of a domicile as like a temple or a palace or something like that, this could be a particular room within the palace, or somebody that is saying these are the rules that you have to follow when you are in this particular area of the palace. Like, we have different sets of etiquette in the kitchen versus in the library or something of that nature. And generally, when we have a benefic bound lord like Venus or Jupiter, it tends to be a more pleasant experience than when we have a malefic bound lord like Saturn or Mars. We cannot have the lights as bound lords, so only the 5 planets that are non-luminaries are bound lords. So that is Mars, Saturn, Venus, and Jupiter, along with Mercury. So, okay, that's what we've got going on at the beginning of the week. And like I said, the sun is going to move about 7 degrees. It moves about a degree each day, and it's going to move into it's not going to move any further than the first decan. But what it is experiencing is a couple things. We are, as I'm recording this, we're building towards the eclipse on the 21st. That aspect hasn't perfected, but when you're going to be listening to this over the weekend and throughout the week, that eclipse will have been perfected, and we'll have this new moon experience. We're still in the middle of that Bardo period, which is kind of a liminal space in between eclipses, where we're still trying to figure out what the new landscape is going to look like for the next chapter of our lives. And one thing that we're experiencing very heavily here is Mercury is co-present with the sun. So that is a condition where it is in the same sign. So instead of just calling it a conjunction, we're calling it co-presence. So Mercury is sitting at the table with the sun and providing information. It is retrograde right now, a retrograde Mercury, and it is going under the beams of the sun right now too. So we have Mercury is kind of hidden. Mercury is in the underworld right now, co-present with the sun, about to go into that furnace of renewal and go into the light. I thought this was a really interesting concept as I was listening to various astrologers talk about this. And in particular, my astrology teacher at Chutababa was talking about the sun giving awareness and knowledge to a planet. So it's kind of like whatever we're experiencing with the mercurial areas of our life, like the Gemini and Virgo area, we're getting kind of this light of the mind type of awareness when we get that Cazimi moment. Now, the Cazimi moment isn't going to happen for, I think, another week or so, but we're going to be kind of reviewing a lot of things and kind of trying to gather the pieces of the old life, not to be able to reconstruct that old life and go on as business as usual. And I talked about this last week with the story of Isis in relationship to Sirius. The ancients had a kind of correlation with the Sirius, the dog star, the guardian of the underworld, and the story of Isis, where she was trying to recover pieces of her husband that had been scattered throughout the land from a vengeful act from her brother Set. But the key to that was that we were not experiencing, she wasn't trying to reconstruct Osiris so that he could continue on living. She was trying to reconstruct him so that he would be able to, they would be able to mate, and that from that mating would be born something new, which was the sun, or the new god, Horus, which was about wisdom and vision, the eye of Horus. So what we're doing is we're gathering the pieces of wisdom from our old experience, not to go back to quote unquote normal, but to try to figure out how we're going to move forward into the new paradigm. Okay, so that's what we've got going on with the sun. A couple other planets that are going to be aspecting the sun. Mars is providing a trine right now. So Mars is bearing witness from the sign of Pisces in the overcoming position, which means it's earlier in the zodiac. So there is a cooperation between Mars and the sun early in the week. But as we move forward in the week and Mars moves into Aries, it will start to square the sun by whole sign, creating more of a feeling of tension. So if you're going to do some martial solar activities, you might want to get those done in the beginning of the week before your energy becomes a little bit more frustrated. The sun is also making a whole sign opposition to Jupiter and Pluto. Okay. So there is some kind of challenge, and oppositions are of the nature of Saturn. So there's some kind of difficult conversation between Jupiter, which is in a fallen position, and the sun, where it's trying to figure out how to provide resources. Whereas Jupiter right now is trying to figure out what needs to be let go of and what needs to be composted so it can make a new start. So those are the aspects we're going to be experiencing. The moon is the host of the sun this week, and the moon is going to be waxing and gaining in light. So we may be trying to increase our ability to bring things into manifestation this week. Okay, so that's the condition of the sun. I'm going to move forward to the planet Saturn. And if we look at our two charts again, we can see that Saturn is still retrograde and not going to be moving very much at all, only a few minutes of 1 degree in the first degree of Aquarius. And Saturn does have rulership. It is in its own domicile. It is the triplicity ruler of the air signs by the daytime, and it is in the bounds of Mercury from 0 to 7 degrees. Now, one of the things that Saturn is going to be experiencing is a whole sign trine to a retrograde Venus that is going to be stationing direct. And Saturn is in the superior position, okay? And also a sextile to Mars once it moves into the sign of Aries. So those are the two conversations that Saturn is going to be having this week. And that could be something where we're getting serious about our relationships with, the contact with Venus, where we're coming to terms with some of the limitations that we have with the choices and reconciling the opposites that we're attempting to bridge with Venus in the sign of Gemini. And with Venus in the sign of Gemini, we have an awareness of our duality right now. And when it's turning direct in that first decan of Gemini, we may be experiencing a new proliferation of options based on the review that we've been doing of what we like, what we are attracted to, and having a realization of what we are and what we're not. So that is something that we're going to be seeing with the contact with Saturn too, is feeling a need perhaps to contract some of the options and let go of some of them as we move forward. Let's talk about Jupiter. So Jupiter is going to be in the sign of Capricorn, moving from 25 degrees of Capricorn to retrograding back into 24 degrees. It is coming into a very close conjunction over the next few weeks with the planet Pluto. It is already applying in I believe that the word is kalesis, which is an adherence. So Pluto and Jupiter are having a very intense conversation right now. They've been in the same sign for a little while, but as they get closer to that conjunction and within 3 degrees, they are very heavily engaged with one another. So that exact conjunction is going to happen on the 30th of June. And then it's going to happen again, I believe, in November. I believe November the 13th, when the planets are going direct again. So Jupiter is in the terms of Saturn this week from 22 to 26 degrees. And of course, it's in its fall where it's in the bottom of the Wheel of Fortune. It's being hosted by a retrograde Saturn that is very strong, but Saturn is in aversion to its host right now. That means that it can't see or witness Jupiter. And that's a problem in Hellenistic astrology. That means that Jupiter is staying at Saturn's estate, but Saturn doesn't really know that Jupiter is there and can't provide the types of resources that it needs to do its job. So it's very difficult for Jupiter ruled things right now. Where it's retrograde, which is basically reviewing and also taking back some things that were given. It's coming in contact with Pluto, so it's bringing up things from the underworld, asking us to compost some of the old life and let go of things, which is very intense right now. It brings up a lot of cathartic, deeply buried emotions that are very difficult to deal with, but necessary. And all the while, Saturn is asking Jupiter to come to terms with being in exile, with doing the hard, disciplined work, to being on the fringes of society, to bringing more restorative justice to the people that have been systemically oppressed on the fringes. We called Saturn in that first decan of Aquarius the mark of exile. So anywhere that Saturn is placed in the zodiac, we have a lot of hard work to do. We come face to face with our ignorance. Last week I talked about Ananke and Agnoia. Ananke being the type of fate that is compelling us to do things, and Agnoia is associated with our ignorance. So we're going to be coming face to face with the type of fate that we've created through our ignorance, through the darkness, through our not knowing, and having to really kind of do the difficult, challenging, but necessary work, necessary, which is another word that's associated with Saturn, necessity, of bringing it back into balance. Remember, Saturn is at its best in its exaltation in the sign of Libra, bringing things back into harmony. So I believe that is some of the work that Saturn asks us to do. Okay, so moving forward to Mars. Mars is a big player in our week ahead here, and in our summer in particular. So Mars is moving through the last degrees of Pisces at the beginning of the week, where it is in, it has rulership by triplicity. It is the triplicity ruler of the nighttime in the water signs. It will be on its own terms from, I believe, 19 to 28 degrees. Yeah, it's got a lot of degrees at the end of the sign there. And then it'll be moving into the terms of Saturn from 28 to 30 degrees. It will be in its own decan, or its own face, in the final degrees of Pisces as well. So it has a lot of dignity at the end of Pisces, but it is gaining, I would say, even more power as it moves into Aries on the 27th, which is Saturday. Okay, so when Mars is in Pisces, it will be making a trine to the sun. So it is aspecting and bearing witness by trine. Trines were of the nature of Jupiter. So generally that was a positive conversation that was bringing good things to a planet. Now Mars bringing, I don't know, Mars always brings good stuff. Like even when Mars is at its best, its nature is still to sever and separate. So there perhaps could be an ability to sever old belief systems, because Jupiter is providing for Mars in Pisces, that is helping us to create a new identity, the sun, and helping us bring a new awareness. And that could be experienced as a positive process. Or we could see positive results with that, with the trine. Mars is still going to be co-present with Neptune, so it's separating now though. So we may be coming out of the fog, we may be coming out of some of the idealism, coming out of the desire to escape, and coming out of this need to have a holy crusade of some sort. Mars is also going to be squaring Venus by whole sign, and that is an overcoming square. So Mars is still creating trouble for Venus at the beginning of this week, but we'll be moving into a sextile to Venus as he moves into Aries. So the relationship between Mars and Venus is going to improve, and the relationship between Mars and the sun is going to get more challenging. So this is always something that we have to consider when we're looking at the aspects of the week, is sometimes we will be having difficult conversations between certain planets, and other times we'll be having more productive or constructive conversations. So again, we're going to be improving the relationship between Mars and Venus, but a more challenging one between Mars and the Sun. Now, the big news too, when Mars moves into Aries, is that it's going to begin to square by whole sign Jupiter, Pluto, and then when Saturn retrogrades back into Capricorn next week, it's going to be squaring Saturn as well. And that's going to be a very difficult aspect we're going to be experiencing over the course of the summer, is that Saturn Mars square. And there's going to be a couple exact hits that I'll talk about when we get to Mars. But basically the energy of that could be like we're feeling like we're driving with the brakes on, or attempting to drive or to take action, but having to work within some pretty severe, strict limitations. Okay. Yeah, and just the dignity that improves with Mars in Aries is that it's in its own domicile. It will be also in its own face. And there's double decanic rulership with Mars in the first face of Aries. Mars will be both the Chaldean and the triplicity ruler. So a very, very martial decan, that first decan of Aries, a very pure expression of Mars, for better or for worse. And Mars will be in the terms of Jupiter from 0 to 6 degrees of Aries. So we'll keep our eyes out on that. When it moves, and like I said, when it moves into Aries, it'll be in its own domicile, so drawing upon all its own resources. Okay, let's move on to Venus. Venus is in the sign of Gemini this week. It is retrograde to begin the week at 5 degrees, but stationing direct on the 25th, which is Thursday. So it will be peregrine at that point or throughout the week, and in the terms of Mercury through 0 to 6 degrees. Now, the challenging thing that we have here is right now it is still receiving an overcoming square from Mars. So Mars is harming Venus right now, creating conflict and challenge, potentially through realizations of the differences that we hold based on our belief systems that are making it very difficult to come to some kind of consensus. Like I said, that condition, that relationship, that conversation with Mars will improve once Mars moves into Aries. There is a trine right now between Saturn and Venus. So Saturn is attempting to provide a positive conversation through showing what our limitations are in our relationships. And we can kind of do the hard work that we need to do to come to a consensus by maybe paring down some of the options that we have, paring down some of the expectations that we may have in our relationships, and letting go of some of the unrealistic types of, I don't know, I'm trying to find another word for expectations, but I guess that's the best word. Getting rid of illusions that aren't serving our relationships anymore. And that's a positive thing between Saturn and Venus right now. Venus, the issue with Venus, beyond its very slow motion and at its station. Now remember, stations are a very important time in a planet's cycle. It's when the omen, the divinitary omen, is speaking at some of its loudest significations when it's stationary, whether it's moving retrograde or moving direct. So really pay attention to that station on the 25th of June. The challenge that we have right now, though, is that Mercury, its host in Cancer, is also retrograde and in that condition I described as an aversion. It's going to be very difficult for a retrograde Mercury to provide anything of value to Venus right now, because like I said, Venus is hanging out in Mercury's estate, or at his estate, and it's difficult for Mercury to provide what it wants because it's not aware that it's there. So that is going to be kind of awkward this week. It's still going to be very difficult to create harmony between our belief systems through our differences throughout the weeks ahead because of that condition. So that's just a warning as we move forward. And again, planetary condition really colors how we're going to experience that planet. Astrology is complicated. I think that one of the things I'm appreciating by studying people like Bernadette Brady, by studying things like Hamlet's Mill and Hellenistic astrology in general, is that, and this is something that Bernadette Brady likes to talk about, a lot of the times what we do is we try to simplify astrology and anything in our modern context as much as we can, which I don't have a fundamental opposition to. I do tend to be the type of teacher that tries to make complex ideas accessible, but I think we can take it too far sometimes where we try to simplify something where we're missing out on some essential qualities that are actually very important to delineating meaning in an accurate way. So I think that we have to be able to hold some of the complexities and some of the details to be able to get a holistic understanding of what we're doing with astrology. And with someone with Jupiter in Virgo in its exile, I feel like that's actually how I would be doing my best work, is trying to bring about many, many disparate details and unify them into some kind of whole that is able to be used in a practical way. So if any of you have like a Jupiter in exile or in a mercurial sign, that may be part of the work that you're tasked with doing, is trying to bring unity to a lot of different details, a lot of different skills and techniques. So I thought that was kind of neat. The moon, just to wrap up our planetary condition report, the moon this week is waxing from its new phase where it just went through an eclipse, where it was conjoined with the North Node, where we were starting a very important chapter, a new 6-month cycle, but also a new 18-year cycle. So there's kind of these meta cycles that we experience with lunar cycles. We have ones that were, it is a month-long cycle, it is like a 6-month cycle, and then it is a longer 18-month cycle. All of these things have importance. And it's going to be waxing to the first quarter, which is kind of that first material challenge to bringing about whatever was signified by our new moon. And at this new moon eclipse, we're trying to figure out how we are going to nurture one another, how we consume resources, and how we distribute them. That's going to be one of the main themes of this eclipse cycle, is how can we figure out an equitable manner of distributing and consumption, whatever the resources are that make us feel nurtured and make us feel included in the group. Remember the Schmidt essence of the moon was inclusion, collecting light, and including people, whereas the sun was selecting. Okay, there's a difference between selecting and including. We have the sun being associated with kings and with people of leadership, where they're saying, we're selecting this person to lead us. This person is special. Where the moon was associated with the public, where we are including everyone in the I don't know, whatever the organization is. And this is why with Cancer, we have these themes of who is our kin, who is our family, who are we including in our respective groups. Its opposite, Saturn, is about exclusion and saying who is not part of our group, who is on the fringe, who are we not allowing in within the group. And again, like I've said, with Saturn in Aquarius right now, we're having to come to terms with who we've excluded as a society from the resources necessary to create a life that is fertile. And we're having a reckoning right now in our country with how we have both exploited the people on the fringes, whether it was through race and through or through economic or gender or sexual orientation type of oppression. We're having to deal with all of those issues simultaneously. We're seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement that that particular struggle is one that is taking extra importance right now due to those folks, Black people, being in danger, and seeing that um, they are being well, abused and murdered and being treated extraordinarily unfairly by a judicial and policing system. So that is one of the things that is speaking the loudest right now. It's not that that hasn't been happening for a very long period of time. It's just that it's now coming to a reckoning point. And for more information on this, there's been a good friend of mine and a very good astrologer whose voice has been justifiably amplified right now. His name is Samuel Reynolds, and he has been really giving some great talks on the United States Pluto return and its relationship with Jupiter and with Mars and Saturn, and giving some really good historical context to even some of the Uranus degrees that we're experiencing. I believe he had a talk where he was comparing the start of the American Revolution with Crispus Atticus, I believe is how you say it, was murdered, and that was one of the initiatory events of the American Revolution. And then with the murder of George Floyd, another initiatory event for the Black Lives Matter movement. And I have shared some of his talks in the descriptions that I've been putting forth below. And he's been making the circuit recently, going and talking to folks like Chris Brennan on the Astrology Podcast. I believe he's joining Stormy Grace, who I was fortunate enough to join and talk about the planets with. So just check out his work. He wrote a really great article on his for astrology.com as well that I will try to link. And so he's been a great voice for learning about some of the history of this and bringing it into context astrologically. So what was I talking about? Losing my train of thought. You know, what I didn't talk about in the planetary condition report was Mercury. Mercury was trying to escape in true retrograde fashion. So yes, Mercury is retrograde this week. It is in the sign of Cancer, moving through that second decan, conjoined with the fixed star Sirius, which we've been talking about as is a quest for immortality. Sometimes Sirius was associated with trying to create something that has longevity, but at the expense of the body. So we can drive ourselves towards some kind of quest, but at the expense of our health, the expense of our mortal coil, and also trying to reconstruct something to bring forth a new birth. Mercury is going to be moving through its own terms from 13 to 19 degrees, and then through the terms of Venus at 7 to 13 degrees as it retrogrades backwards. It's going to be conjoining the sun. It's under the sun's beams. It will be trining Mars in Pisces, and then it will be squaring Mars in Aries, with Mars overcoming. So that is another thing that we're going to have to watch out for, as our communication is going to get a little spicy when Mercury moves into a square with Aries, because some of the indirectness of Mars and Pisces is going to fall by the wayside, and we're going to be having much more direct confrontational type of communicative energies if we haven't been already. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And also Mercury is going to be opposing Jupiter and Jupiter and Pluto in the sign of Capricorn. So difficult conversations, lots of difficult communications. It's not an easy communicative next few weeks. And Mercury is going to be hosted by the moon. So there'll be a lot of different moods that we're going to be working through as we try to cipher out our mercurial communications. When Mercury is moving through the sign of Cancer, it's sort of like we're trying to speak underwater. We're trying to move through layers and layers and layers of emotion, of intuition, of ambiguity and uncertainty. And it's like our minds are not completely clear. We have all these impressions, all these sense memories that are coming up and are kind of getting in the way of trying to have a clear focus. And I can speak from experience with Mercury. I have Mercury in the third decan of Cancer, and it is retrograde. So a lot of the times when I'm trying to communicate, what I've noticed is that I will get many images flashing through my brain, and I have to kind of pick and choose which ones are going to come out of my mouth. A lot of memories come up. I have a lot more difficulty communicating if I'm feeling emotional. I also, what I've noticed too, and when I go back and review my podcast sometimes just to learn more, I tend to start some sentences and some ideas without completely finishing them because a new idea has come up and I want to follow that train of thought. So I've been trying to, this week in particular, maybe try to finish an idea before I start a new one. It's difficult because when you have a mind that is constantly flashing with those types of sensory impressions, like I said, it's difficult to figure out which thread you're going to follow. Okay, so that may be happening on the collective level as well. And I'm just trying to speak from experience right there. So that is what I have for the planetary condition report. I know it's a little bit longer for the planetary condition, but I thought that would give us some really good contextualization about what these planets are going to be trying to do. And as I go through the daily reports and do some deeper dives on the mythology and the meaning and the decans and the aspects that are perfecting, you'll have some context to be able to work with it. All right. I'm going to move forward to Monday. And we are going to talk about Monday the 22nd. I'm going to go to one chart here. So on, whoops, my notes are trying to fall over. On Monday, June the 22nd. Now, if you follow numerology at all, there are certain numbers that they call master numbers or higher octaves of the single digits, and 22 is called the master builder, higher octave of 4, where you're trying to build maybe more, bring divine ideals onto the material plane and build for a collective rather than just on a personal level. So I always keep an eye out for master numbers like 11 and 22 and realize that sometimes those might have more significance within our collective experience. There may be things that are being built on these days or energy that has much more far-reaching ramifications than a normal day sometimes. So keep an eye out for that. So what we're doing when we are starting with Monday the 22nd, I'm going to move the sun to the ascendant here. The first thing I wanted to point out is we are beginning the day with the moon in Cancer, still in that new moon phase. The moon will be escaping the bond, which if you remember me talking about the bond is at new moons and full moons, the moon is hidden within that 15-degree orb, so and under the beams. So when the moon escapes the bond is when the moon is technically, I guess, becoming visible or escaping from the heat, the huge heat of the furnace. And we see that moment very similarly as like a condition of phasis, like when a planet changes directions or when a planet emerges from that furnace. That omen is speaking a little bit louder. It's giving us some context as to what was going on behind the scenes, behind the curtain, in the hidden, like in the underworld. It's emerging from the underworld. And the first aspect it makes, it gives us some insight into what we might be experiencing as the moon is waxing towards its fullness. So at about 7 a.m., 15 degrees of Cancer, it will emerge from under the bond. And the first aspect it makes beyond this conjunction with retrograde Mercury is in opposition to retrograde Jupiter. So it is retrograde, it is aspecting a benefic planet, but it is through an opposition. So there is some kind of challenge or some kind of conflict where we may be trying to bring some sort of abundance into our lives, but we're running into a planet that is not in its favorite place. It is in its fall, where we're, instead of trying to grow and have connections with our higher self, we may be trying to let go of some of our old material belief systems and contract. So there may be some conflict this new moon cycle in figuring out what we want to include, Cancer and the moon, and what we need to exclude. Okay, so what stays and what goes, and that's going to be something that may bring us a little bit of an existential crisis over the next few weeks. So the moon, as I just mentioned, is going to be conjoining retrograde Mercury before it escapes the bond at 4 o'clock in the morning at 14 degrees of Cancer. It will trine Neptune at 20 degrees of Pisces at 4:21 p.m. And then it will make an opposition to both Pluto and Jupiter in their retrograde cycles at 24 degrees at 10:18 p.m. and then 11:28 p.m. So the beginning of Monday, we're going to see that moon escaping the bond. We may be starting to gather resources as far as information that we need to bring about this manifestation of this new karmic seed and this new narrative chapter that we've been assigned, that we are experiencing at that eclipse energy. Remember, we're still in that Bardo period. We're still in this kind of period where the butterfly within the cocoon is dissolving its all of its, oh, I don't know, what are they called? All of its DNA and reforming into something new. So it's this liminal space in between paradigms. And we have, like I said, we have a trine and a conjunction, but then some challenging oppositions throughout the end of the day. So something to pay attention to on Monday is what is the story that you're going to be trying to bring to fruition at the full moon, at the next eclipse, which happens on July 5th. And that is going to be a full moon lunar eclipse. Okay, so that one will be more associated with K2, the south node, where we're processing something old and the energy is leaving rather than something new coming in at the north node, which is called Rahu. That's the mouth of the dragon, the severed head of the dragon that is trying to consume the elixir of life or the elixir of immortality. But it can never be satisfied. Remember that. That is something to consider when we think of eclipses. Eclipses in traditional astrology were thought of as malefic events. They were pretty freaked out when the lights, the sources of vitality, were being turned off or being consumed. So I think that's something to realize when we are examining those eclipses, is that sometimes they can bring challenging circumstances. They're not a good time to like go charge your crystals. It's not something that you want to. It's not an energy that you want to bottle, I guess. Okay, it's something to move through. And in ancient times, there was something to protect against. So consider that. All right, let's move forward to Tuesday, the 23rd. Okay, on Tuesday, June 23rd, the moon is in Cancer, but it moves into the sign of Leo at 8:33 a.m. We're continuing our new moon phase at the 45 degrees after the new moon, before we are getting to the crescent, the waxing crescent phase. So we're still kind of getting clear on what our divine assignment is. And the big news of the day is that Saturn will be stationing retrograde. Yeah, Neptune. I wrote stationing direct, but I meant stationing retrograde. Neptune will be stationing retrograde at 20 degrees of Pisces at 12:32 a.m. Now, this isn't something that is super rare. The outer planets move in retrograde motion for a substantial part of the year. So a lot of people will have retrograde outer planets in their charts, in their birth charts. So I tend to pay more attention to the retrogrades of the seven, or the inner planets, because the sun and the moon don't ever retrograde. The 5 non-lunar or non-luminary visible planets. But if you wanted to extrapolate some meaning from that, we might be reviewing some of the things that we were trying to transcend through Neptune. We may be reviewing some of the illusions that we may have taken on through this last Mars Neptune conjunction. We may be going internal more for our escapism. And so instead of like externally trying to escape something, we may be escaping something on a psychological level and not wanting to deal with something, you know, in our minds and in our hearts. So just keep your eyes peeled for that, for those types of impulses, and just be aware that that is something that is happening. We may also see with Neptune generally being associated with ambiguity and toxins as well. There may be something in the collective where we're reviewing something poisonous too. We may see like a, I don't know, like an environmental protection type of review, or some kind of challenge, like a, I don't know, like a chemical leak or something like that. I know that astrology can be very literal sometimes. I'll just briefly tell you a story about Mercury going retrograde. Is in my community here, the day that Mercury was stationing retrograde, slowing down to a halt, we had 2 water mains that broke, probably due to some kind of construction, but 2 Mercury dual, right? Water mains. Mercury is in the water sign of Cancer, and a reversal, something that is not functioning. Remember, Mercury was a messenger, and it was like a pathway. It was clearing a pathway for things to connect. It was the connection between the world of the mortal world and the world of the underworld. So I thought it was just very literal and interesting that the pathways for receiving water ceased to function. And it was a sort of a temporary delay. We went out and got some jugs of water just in case, because I have a feeling that may be revisited through the retrograde cycle, just to be prepared. But yeah, I believe that there was someone else that was talking about their dishwasher was stuck on a cycle, or, you know, I've heard people talk about their washing machines breaking, or anything that was related to water. One of my favorite astrologers, Austin Coppock, has had a story, I believe, about his dishwasher or something completely going on the fritz during a Mercury retrograde in the water sign. So keep an eye out for that during this Mercury retrograde cycle, as well as anything related to literally to water could be needing a review. Okay, so that may be some of the things we're experiencing as well with Neptune going retrograde, but potentially more on a collective level. Really examining our collective belief systems and the way that we may be, I don't know, one of the buzzwords lately is spiritually bypassing, where we are failing to deal with a difficult, tangible issue, and trying to rationalize it away with our spirituality. And my astrology teacher, Truth Baba, has some really good material on that recently, if you want to check out his channel. We've talked about that a lot in class, like especially in relationship to coming to terms with some of the more unpleasant factors of traditional astrology, because that's one of the kind of existential crises that you go through when you start studying traditional astrology. Is the language that they use is sometimes not as constructive, and sometimes talks about the destruction of form. And that can be experienced as unpleasant. We've done this kind of thing in the last, I don't know, few decades of astrology, where they even refused to publish the word malefic in astrological circles, because there was this kind of, I guess, spiritual bypassing, where we're saying that, you know, we don't want to experience anything negative, and because we have evolved beyond negativity. And I think that that's one of the things that I had to come to terms with studying traditional astrology, is not necessarily experiencing things as bad. It's thinking of it in a different way, and more in a cycle of increase and decrease, the increase and the decrease of light, the increase and decrease of form, of things coming into being and things passing away. None of those things are inherently wrong. It's just that as human beings, we tend to gravitate towards growth and increase because we feel we're attached to that, especially in Western civilizations. I don't think it's necessarily as true for other civilizations, but I can't speak to that with great authority because I wasn't raised in those other cultures and I don't live in those other cultures. But I know as a Westerner in America, the mythology, the stories that that we've bought into as a collective or that we've been fed have been ones of exponential growth. And anything related to death, decay, contraction, loss is thought of as taboo and thought of as weakness. And I think that that's the biggest shift that we're going through as a collective right now. And one of the biggest reckonings with America is that we have to come to terms with death, decay, contraction, with not necessarily having to win all the time, because loss is a part of life. What goes up must come down. What is born must eventually die. And if we take away the moral judgment of those natural cycles and view them objectively as cycles of nature, that helps us appreciate them. So I think that that is something that we are going to be coming to terms with as a collective, I think with some of the retrogrades of our collective belief systems with Neptune as well. All right, so some of the other lunar aspects of the day on Tuesday. The moon is going to be making a trine to Mars from 27 degrees of Cancer to 27 degrees of Pisces at 3:20 in the a.m. Then the moon will move into Leo at 8:33 a.m. It will come into an opposition very shortly after ingressing into Leo with Saturn in Aquarius. So that happens around 9:30 a.m., a retrograde Saturn. And then the only other lunar aspect of the day is the moon will make a sextile from 5 degrees of Leo to retrograde Venus at 5 degrees of Gemini. So in the beginning of the day on Tuesday, we may come face to face with our limitations. We may have feelings of wanting to craft an identity and have issues of pride bubble up. I know that what I've experienced with a lot of the Leo moons is in the collective is we will see the need for limitations that serve the group, and then people will have a negative reaction based on their own personal individual desires and their individual desires to have freedom and personal identity and personal choice. So I think that that may be something that is highlighted on Tuesday the 23rd is this kind of like Saturn is saying no, and the moon in Leo is very much wanting to say yes, and the conflicts that are inherent in that. With the sextile with retrograde Venus, we're just maybe seeing some kind of positive communication between the moon trying to bring something into being, potentially triggering something from the past, like a communication, a relationship from the past, but bringing it back into harmony, hopefully. Again, Venus's condition is challenged right now, being retrograde and stationing, and then being provided for by a retrograde Mercury that is not witnessing the domicile. Yeah, and one of the things I would say that is coming up in the collective that I've observed that speaks to that lunar Leo Aquarian Saturn type of opposition is the concept of the mask, right? And that's been a real hot button issue that has become politicized and become, I don't know. I'm just thinking right now, I'm pausing because I had an experience the other day. I am choosing to wear a mask when I go outside, even if I'm going on a walk. And I believe California made this mandatory recently. But the state that I live in, Michigan, there's a lot of folks here that really, really are against that. And I think part of it is that the people in power right now have made it into a political issue rather than a public safety issue, which is really, it's difficult because for me, it's a public safety issue. I want to keep my community safe. I want to keep my family safe. And I've been experiencing a lot of discomfort when I go outside, and harassment. We are the only family in our neighborhood that wears a mask when we're going outside. I'm sure that there is some others that do, but we haven't seen them for a while. And people will, we feel very conspicuous when we go out. And I had some neighbors that were literally catcalling us as we were going out and mocking us. And it was hurtful. It was painful. And I guess what I will say, my experience of that is, it's one thing, I think, to make the argument that you have a personal choice as far as if you want to wear it or not. I still believe that for the good of the community, wearing a mask is important. But I think that actively mocking someone for making the choice to wear it is a whole another level of distaste to me. And I'm really struggling with that. It's making me very uncomfortable, even just going outside in my own community. And I wonder if you all are feeling any of that as well. I think that could be part of it. And I think that with the moon in Leo, one of the things that the mask, I want to talk about the mask a little bit, because, you know, masks have a lot of cultural significance and they have a lot of meaning wrapped up in them. And I think that one of the things that we struggle with as a community in America here is we have exalted individual identity, and we've exalted, our, ability to, quote unquote, or the illusion of being able to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And we have this kind of masculine, I guess almost like cowboy aesthetic in our country, where if you're showing any sign of weakness or feminine weakness, feminine, I use that not in a gender quality, but like active versus receptive type of, but you could apply it to that, I guess, too. I mean, there's definitely toxic masculinity in our country. And I think that I've been trying to unpack what it means and why people feel so threatened by that. And I think part of it is feeling sadness over the loss of maybe some individual identity, rejecting the loss of what they consider personal choice. I think that we have a very naive understanding of what freedom really is in this country. We have this kind of a great portion of the country has a freedom at all costs. And I don't think that that's what the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence is all about. I don't think that your individual choice has an override on the good of the community. At least I hope it doesn't. I would hope that for the folks that are taking that position, yes, I will acknowledge that there could be a slippery slope about taking away other rights, and that is something we definitely have to keep an eye on, that we don't fall into a system that is too authoritarian. But I also think it's important to balance that out with a respect for one another and a respect for our community. And yeah, I think that showing vulnerability is not always a sign of weakness. It is a sign of strength. And I think I wanted to make that point. I think that acknowledging that there are forces that are greater than your own ego, which something like a virus could be acknowledging, is that there are forces of nature that are just have more power than we do, that don't discriminate, that are going to take people from every demographic, every economic demographic, every racial demographic, every gender, every sexual orientation. Although I will say that is something that should be acknowledged too, is that the virus does seem to be having a greater impact on people of color, and because of some other systemic issues about healthcare and things like that. So I definitely want to acknowledge that. But I do think that things like diseases can be also great equalizers. And realizing, and comes back to humility. We're being humbled as a nation right now. And the more that we hang on to that hubris, the more and more difficult it's going to be to make the changes that we need to make. And I'm just saying this from some of my personal experience and feeling very, very uncomfortable in my community right now. And I wonder, like I said, share in the comments, how is it going in your communities? I know I have a lot of international viewers too. Like, I know in other countries, this isn't as stigmatized as it is. It hasn't been made into this political issue. Like I believe in like Asian countries, you know, it's the exact opposite. Like, you're stigmatized if you're not wearing it. You're not wearing the mask. You know, you're thought of as selfish. And I just wonder, what is your experience of this been? Because my astrological opinion too is that we are not done with the pandemic, and we are going to see a conjunction of Jupiter and Pluto again at the end of the month, and again in November, which most astrologers that I've been absorbing information from have really talked about Jupiter Pluto as being one of the main signifiers of the illness itself. So anybody who's been asking me, I've been telling them, do not relax right now. This is not a time to relax. And what do you really have to lose beyond, you know, your life? I don't know. Now I'm starting to see the other side of this thing. This is how my brain works, is I'll make a statement and then the other argument will come up in my mind. And I guess, yes, it is difficult because we are losing our ability to support ourselves by not being able to work sometimes. And, you know, again, communities of color have been affected more intensely than white communities, again, with this. And I believe that has to do with some of our systemic challenges with how we receive healthcare and things of that nature. So I don't know. It's complicated. I will admit that. But take care of each other and try to, I don't know, I'll get off my soapbox here, but you know, it's okay to release some of that individuality temporarily. Doesn't mean that you're going to be consumed into a completely homogenous experience. They will never be able to take away the flame of your inner light. You know, if you are, I think I'll say it like this, like, if you're completely identified with an external appearance of power and of individuality, that is only surface and that will never last. And if you can get in touch with the flame of your heart that is both unique and a point of consciousness, but also part of a greater whole, that's when you've really got something eternal that can never be taken away from you, whether you hide your face or not. And I think that's something to consider as we move forward through our week here. Okay, let me move forward. Wednesday, the 24th, the moon will continue to move through Leo, continuing to make that opposition to Saturn. The only other aspect we're feeling with this on Wednesday is the moon will be making a square to Uranus at 9 degrees of Leo and Taurus. So again, this may be, you know, bringing up feelings of rebellion, feelings of wanting to shake up the status quo, issues of pride over resources and about identity. So it's making a big T-square between the moon, Uranus, and Saturn. And I'm afraid that on some level I may be preaching to the choir with this kind of thing, although I know that I have definitely had some listeners that don't agree with me, and that's okay. We can hold opposing viewpoints and agree to disagree. That is totally within the realm of possibility. And also, some folks will come here and get certain information and not always agree with all my belief systems, and that's okay too. Try to take what you can from it, and if there's other things that you don't resonate with, then you don't have to incorporate that. That's fine. But again, on Wednesday the 24th, that is the main aspect of the day, as we may be getting shaken up. Some of our senses of identity are going to be shaken up, and how we are moving through our day and trying to bring a sense of selection and what does make us special. These are tough times for Leo type energies. It is very Saturn heavy right now, and Leo is a very solar type of energy. So we're really being asked to do a lot of Aquarian type things, which can be really uncomfortable for any type of Leo type of person out there, or any type of Leo energy where we're saying, this is me and this is what I want and this is who I am. And I feel you, because I'm a Leo ascendant, and it is a little bit of it's a humbling energy. And if there's one thing that Leos don't always enjoy, it's having to be humbled, but it's necessary, and we're probably the ones that need it the most. So bring it, right? Okay, let's get into some of the meat of this forecast here. So I'm going to move forward to Thursday, the 25th. You doing all right out there? Everybody hanging in there? Yeah, there's been a lot of things going on lately with humility. We had a kind of an issue with our mayor in our small little town here in Michigan, who made some pretty inappropriate remarks, some very racially insensitive remarks. And right as Venus was retrograding over her natal Venus, almost exactly. The astrology of it was pretty intense. And she's going through quite a humility, a hubris falling right now, a tower experience. And you know, that's if we go through those experiences with grace, I think that's the way to go through those. If you double down and you try to protect the old belief and the old experience that was shown to be, you know, not something that is effective anymore, or of a way to relate to people, that's when we really experience the hardship. It was when we double down on it. So if you are experiencing anything like that, I know a lot of folks are. A lot of people are experiencing a lot of humblings, even if it's just an awareness of some of the biases that we may have taken for granted, and or the privilege that we've taken for granted. That can be really, really humbling. And my advice, just go through it gracefully, ask a lot of questions, do a lot of the hard work yourself, and try not to get too have the reaction that I would advise against is a reaction of self-pity, because that's really not the right reaction. The reaction is just saying, hey, you know what, that is something that I'm realizing is no longer going to serve myself or my community anymore, and that's okay. It's just a contraction. It's less about feeling overwhelming shame and guilt, although those feelings serve a purpose. It is okay to acknowledge those feelings in the beginning of the process, but getting stuck in them is not effective. Let those feelings drive you towards the hard work of making the internal changes and educating yourself. I think that's, like I said, I've been saying, education is the key to making that change. And then once you've been able to start releasing those, that's when you can feel like you're really embracing something new when you've let go of the old. Okay, Thursday the 25th, the moon will be moving from Leo into the sign of Virgo. So we'll be coming out of that kind of difficult relationship with Saturn and coming into a sextile with the sun. The moon's going to sextile the sun and Mercury. It's going to also begin to trine Uranus, and but it will be making an opposition by whole sign to Mars. So that's the only challenging part that we have here. On Thursday, the 25th, Venus is going to be stationing direct at 5 degrees of Gemini at 2:48 in the morning. And remember, we've talked about that first decan of Gemini being associated with the Eight of Swords, where we had a blindfolded figure that was bound and surrounded by swords and paralyzed by the proliferation of options. So we may be revisiting a new proliferation of options and trying to move forward with choices after we've been getting in touch with what we really want, what we really desire. We've been shown the ways that we create discord, I think. And we've been shown the ways that I know that the mayor in our town was shown the way that she created division. And now with Venus moving forward in that sign of Mercury, we're doing the repair work to try to bring back together disparate viewpoints. And when we've been shown kind of how things were dysfunctional, how do we do the work of creating unity again? And we've done this as a collective too. We've seen how we're different. Venus, its essential nature is to harmonize and bring things together. And when it's been going retrograde, it's been, throwing up a huge awareness of how that is not functioning properly. Now the challenge again with Venus is it's hosted by a retrograde Mercury. So again, it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be an overnight solution. And Mercury is going through its own challenges right now. Mercury is kind of busy in the underworld. Mercury is away. Mercury is in that underworld retrograde, trying to collect all the pieces of Osiris to build something new, and not able to provide as much of the answers yet. So this is a great time for collecting information. It's a great time for kind of still, before you're able to create unity again, to still come to an awareness of all the things that may have caused the separation in the first place, and start to make choices. So that's what I would do with this particular energy. The moon's going to move into Virgo at 1:04 p.m. It will make a sextile to the sun at 9:33 p.m. at 4 degrees of Virgo and Cancer. And then it's going to square a newly direct Venus at 5 degrees of Virgo and Gemini at 10:17 p.m. So again, you may have some kind of challenging conversations, potentially due to some of the realizations that you have about how you have grown apart in some of your relationships, and how you create harmony within your community or within your family or within your relationship. All right, let's move forward to Friday. On Friday, June the 26th, the moon is going to be moving through the sign of Virgo, where it is the triplicity ruler of the earth signs. It is moving into the waxing crescent phase. That phase actually began on Thursday the 25th. So the waxing crescent phase is about gathering the resources necessary to bring something into fruition. Remember, the moon was the kind of the membrane surrounding the earth that allowed things in and allowed things to pass out of being. And in the waxing phase, it's allowing energy in and trying to bring forms into being. It was associated with nurturing and with growing a baby in the womb. So we're trying to grow some kind of karma baby, like at this new moon eclipse that's going to come, and be born at that full moon. So we're gathering resources right now. If we're think about in terms of pregnancy, we're gathering all sorts of nutrients for the child. We're consuming all sorts of things, and we may come to some kind of challenge with Venus with the square. All right, let's move with Friday the 26th. It is going to be making a trine to Uranus at 5:44 a.m. at 9 degrees. And then a sextile to retrograde Mercury at 10:17 a.m. at 12 degrees of Virgo and 12 degrees of Cancer. So some harmonious aspects on Friday. Again, we may be able to incorporate the changes practically that Uranus is asking of us in the sign of Taurus. Also, we may have some fruitful conversations or fruitful reviews. Okay, reviews of information. We may have to be redoing things and taking care of some details that we may have missed. The only challenge with the moon right now is it is being hosted by a retrograde Mercury, so we may be reskilling or relearning something. So that may be part of the themes that we're going through on Friday. If I move forward to the 27th, June 27th, Saturday, here we have some of the Mars significations that I wanted to do more of a deep dive on. So I'm going to talk about Mars in general, but let's move through the lunar aspects first, and then I'll talk about the mythology and the significations of Mars. All right, so let me look and get an idea here. Okay. So on Saturday, the moon will be making an opposition to retrograde Neptune at 20 degrees of Virgo and Pisces at 12:56 a.m., very early in the morning. It will then trine both retrograde Pluto and Jupiter at 6:24 and 6:51 a.m. at about 24 degrees. And then it'll make an opposition to Mars at 4 p.m. at 29 degrees, that what some people call the anaretic degree. In Hellenistic astrology, one of the things we talk about with a planet being in the final degrees is that it is in a malefic bound. So I believe, where is Mars right now? Mars is in the terms of Saturn. So there will be some challenges, some tough conversations about contraction and how our actions are facilitating exclusion or facilitating contraction. So that's something that we may be experiencing, and the moon is activating that experience through an opposition. So the big news of the day on Saturday the 27th is after that opposition, after we have one final like hiccup. I don't know if it's a final hiccup, but in that particular sign, okay, at about 9:45 p.m., Mars is going to move into its own domicile of Aries. Now, this is significant. There we go, roughly around 9:45, 10 o'clock. So you can see here, Mars is now at 0 degrees of Aries, first decan. It is now going to be in an overcoming square to both the Sun and Mercury. So that creates tension between Mars and the Sun and Mercury. It is making a sextile ray to Venus now. So it is attempting to potentially assist Venus, although what kind of help does Mars give? We'll unpack it. It is now also coming into a whole sign square to Jupiter and Pluto, which can exacerbate some of those qualities that we're experiencing with the Jupiter-Pluto conjunction of the corruption energy that we've been experiencing through our organized material hierarchical structures. So that could, we're going to feel some anger related to those now, some conflict, some tension, if we haven't already. Like, it's going to get louder, is what I will say. So let's unpack Mars, because Mars is now going to be in the sign of Aries for the next 6 months, which is a long time. Every other year, Mars and Venus retrograde and spend a significant portion of time in one particular sign. And Mars will be in Aries from the 27th of June till January 6th of 2021. So literally 6 months. It is going to station retrograde on September 9th at 28 degrees of Aries, and then station direct again on November 13th at 15 degrees of Aries. During that time, it is going to make a square to retrograde Saturn at 26 degrees of Capricorn on August the 24th of this year, with Saturn overcoming. It will then make another square to Saturn when Saturn is direct and Mars is retrograde on the 29th of September. Okay, so that's important. That is a very intense aspect. And I talked a little bit earlier about feeling like we're driving with our foot on the brake, right? So it's kind of this intense energy of wanting to move forward, but having to work within these very strict limitations. And it's going to be a rough summer. I'm just not going to beat around the bush with you. We're heading up to an election year. Things are going to intensify. You know, a lot of the, I don't know, a lot of the gaslighting and propaganda is going to get louder. A lot of the attempts to hold on to power, potentially corrupt attempts to hold on to power, are going to become even more magnified. And there's going to be definitely a feeling of oppression as we move forward, with Saturn being in the superior position to Mars. Okay, that means Saturn has the upper hand. You know, that feeling of limitation, that feeling of contraction is in some way limiting our ability to take action, okay? Our ability to express our anger and to get the catharsis that we need through that, and the change that we need. Now, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read to you from Demetra George's book, Ancient Astrology in Theory and Practice. Really like the way that she summarizes planets. So here is on page 49. This is her little paragraph on Mars. So she says, Mars was understood by ancient astrologers as the dry, fiery, and hot powder that is destructive of the life force as it appears both in nature and in human character. This planet was associated with violence, wars, anger, murder, danger, recklessness, the hunt and chase, combat, torture, and bloodshed. It led to estrangements, breaches in friendship, enemies, lawsuits, theft, and the taking away of belongings. It signifies lies, reproaches, and perjury. It governs those who gain their ends through the use of fire and iron. Sexually, it was connected with the procreative impulse and sexual intercourse, as well as adulteries, ruination of women, and abortion. In the body, it was said to rule the head, seat, genitals, blood, sperm duct, bile, adrenals, and the elimination of excrement. It brings fevers, inflammations, ulcerations, and pustules. It is the color red. It is acidic in taste, and its metal is iron, and its day is Tuesday. When Mars is in good condition, it can make the person daring, valiant, courageous, indomitable, and conversant in danger. It signifies military leaders, warriors, and success in warfare. However, when it is in poor condition, it makes the native a wrongdoer, blasphemous, uncontrollable, and reckless. It may bring severe bodily suffering. The poetic name of Mars is Puerdes. Puerdes? Puerdes. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Puroeides, which means the fiery one. The Babylonians knew him as Nergal, the god of the underworld, fevers, plagues, and war, whom the Greeks associated with ARES, their own god of war, violence, and anger. The Roman Martis was a protector of the empire through his military prowess and valor. The nature of Mars is to energize. Its essence, according to Valens, is action and effort. From a modern perspective, it is the archetype of the warrior and competitor. Okay, so I thought that was a great summary. I'll add to that that Schmidt calls the essence of Mars severance and separation. So that is what it is trying to do. It is severing and separating. It is a malefic planet that is the antithesis of life. It is associated with death. It is associated with, in an agricultural metaphor, the fruit severing from the vine and, being able to harvest, right? But also death and decay. Mars has its exaltation in Capricorn when death is strongest on the earth, or when the light or when the darkness is the strongest. Mars is of the night sect. So it is on the team of planets that have political power when the moon is the sect leader, or if you are born with the sun below the horizon, the moon will be your sect leader. Now, the lunar sect was about change. It was about the realm of fortune, with things coming into being and things passing out of being. So another thing to consider with Mars is it takes its joy in the 6th house. And the 6th house was called one of the fortune houses. So both the 6th house and the 5th house were the houses of 2K, or of fortune. And 2K was like, the, oh boy, I'm going to get rid of that. 2K was the concept of the more randomized distributions of fate. There it is. I'm trying to spell it with my mouse. 2K, Tyche. Okay. And the 6th house was the house of Malus 2K, bad fortune. And the 5th house, the house of good fortune. So Venus had its joy in the 5th house. which is also of the lunar sect, and Mars had its joy in the 6th house, which is of the lunar sect. So we could think of Mars too as being kind of a more random distribution of negative fate. And we can see in the tradition that the 6th house was associated with injury, illness, accidents, enemies also was one of the significations, that in the 12th house. So you can think about it in an injury or an illness. It's something that befalls you. It's a fortune that is not always necessarily your fault. If you have an accident, if you trip and fall and break your leg, that's a martial type of event. That is a severing. That is a separation. That is a kind of a instance of bad fortune. So that is something to consider with Mars too. And just like the opposite with that is we have the spirit houses 11 and 12, which are called the houses of daimon. And the 12th house is associated with the malus daimon, which is Saturn, and Jupiter is the good daimon, the fortunate daimon. And those are associated with the sun, because they are on the solar sect. And those may be more about actions that are taken through your own awareness, through pranoia, through your ability to have the light of the mind. Saturn, the concept of punitive justice, right? Punishment. I think we can think of the 12th house as a house of isolation, of prisons, of hospitals, potentially of like reaping what we are sowing from our actions in the negative, but to be redeemed. I've like calling Saturn a redeemer, because I do think that Saturn isn't just like making us suffer for no reason. I think that it is a necessary part of bringing things back into balance. Just as Jupiter could be thought of some of the distributive justice that we are, like some of the good things that we're receiving based on the merit of our actions, of the positive things that we are doing through our pronoia, through our knowing, through our knowledge, through our foreknowledge, okay? So what we're having here when Mars is starting to square Saturn is we've got a real conflict between the concept of punitive justice, which that sounds like the prison and the police system, and the randomized acts of negativity, of anger, the expression of accidents and things like that. So I think that, unfortunately, I will predict that there is probably going to be more violence this summer in regards to either protests or things like martial law, things like the military becoming more prevalent, because Saturn's going to be in that overcoming position. The hand of order, I guess you'd call it, is going to be really trying to squash any martial uprising. Now, what do we do about that? Well, I don't have the greatest answer yet. Let's talk a little bit more about Mars's mythology, and that may be giving us some solutions. So Mars, or ARES in Greek, Mars in the Roman language, was the son of Zeus and Hera. And he was the father of Deimos, which translates to terror, and Phobos, which translates to fear. And both of those were through his illicit affair with Aphrodite, or Venus. So Venus was married to like this, to Hephaestus, who is the blacksmith, who was kind of a homely dude who toiled away at his anvil, creating these beautiful weapons and shields and all these like girdles of the gods. And I believe that Aphrodite was promised by, I don't know if it was by Zeus or whatever, to Hephaestus, the most homely of the gods, so that people wouldn't fight over her or something like that. But she was not necessarily faithful. So some of the significations of infidelity with Mars can come up because they had kind of this illicit affair. And the story goes that they were caught in the act because Hephaestus kind of got wise to the fact that they were having an affair, and created this net that would like fall on them in their conjugal bed. And he caught them in the act, like in a compromising position. And all of the gods came to, well, I guess the story was the female gods didn't come to witness because it would be uncouth, but all the male gods came and mocked Ares and Aphrodite, and shamed them and things like of that nature. So some of the mythology behind that. But interesting that through their union we have things like terror and fear. There were also through their mating the asteroid that we've named an asteroid over, ARIES, the goddess of discord, and Enyo, who is the goddess of war and violence, and Eros, the god or goddess of lust, and lastly Harmonia, which is associated with harmony. So we've got terror, fear, discord, war, lust, and ultimately harmony, right? So some interesting significations from ARIES and the ARIES myths. Now, the medieval qualities, like the Aristotelian qualities that we could assign to Mars, is it's very hot and dry. It's near the celestial sphere of the sun, so it speeds things up. Whenever something is hot, we see it speeding something up, and drying qualities have qualities of separating. So you can see when the earth gets really hot and dry, it splits, and that can be some of the, what we think about with relationship to Mars. Mars wants to take action. It wants to go to battle. It is the raw qualities of raw brutality, raw power, rage. It is the least favorite son of Zeus. So I thought this was kind of interesting too. I wanted to quote something from the Iliad, or the Iliad, I don't know how to pronounce it. But here is a quote. It says, this is when Mars had returned wounded and crippled from a battle. It says, then looking at him darkly, Zeus, who gathers the clouds, spoke to him. Do not sit behind me and whine, you double-faced liar. To me, you are the most hateful of all gods who hold Olympus. Forever quarreling is dear to your heart, wars and battles. And yet I will not long endure to see you in pain, since you are my child. And it was to me that your mother bore you. But you were born of some other god, and proved so ruinous long since you would have been dropped beneath the gods of the bright sky. Okay, so this is like Zeus showing his contempt for his son Ares, but also being like, hey, you know what, you're my son, so that means I can't completely discard you. Okay. Ares was more dignified when he was called Mars in the Roman civilization. The Greeks were not a huge fan of Ares. They were like, this is uncivilized, this is uncouth, this is like all the things. I believe they were almost trying to repress this energy, so to speak. But in the Roman culture, they exalted war, they exalted battle, and Ares as Mars took on more of the significations of courage, of something like a protector of the realm or something like that. But it definitely is based on the cultural normatives that the stories came from. One other thing that I thought was horrifying but interesting was that they associated dog sacrifice with Mars. There were ritualistic puppy sacrifices in some of these cultures to propitiate Mars, which I thought was horrible. And I don't know, I can't make this stuff up. So I wonder if any of the people in the news that we've seen, like that are, where we see abuses of pets or animals, have a really poorly placed Mars. Like one person that comes to mind is the football player Michael Vick, who was convicted of abusing dogs or dog fighting or things like that. And I wonder where his Mars was. I'm trying to look it up real quick here. Michael Vick natal chart. Let's see if my theory plays out. Well, he has a Mars-Saturn conjunction, which is not always said to be very pleasant. And that is making a square to his moon and a square to his Venus. So both of those are overcoming his Venus. But I think that his Mars and his Saturn are very, very tightly conjoined. And that was a fairly negative condition in Hellenistic astrology. So yeah, that could be part of it. But anyway, I just thought that was an interesting aside, or one that was like kind of like, wow, I'm glad that that's hopefully less of an issue. I'm really quite surprised at how literal some of the significations play out. One little side note, digression before I move forward with Mars, is that when I was doing some research on fixed stars, I came across some information about, what is his name? The Kneeler. And this says, who is the Kneeler? Oh man, I gotta find him again. So I had a fixed star that was in Sagittarius that was called the Kneeler. Yeah, so the Kneeler's name was El Neelam, okay? And this is at, oh, wait a second. Oh, geez. Now I'm getting myself in trouble by riffing here. Like, well, anyway, the gist of it is that at this particular position, it was associated with the god who is kneeling in humility. And okay, yeah, this was Ras Al-Gethi. And I thought it was so fascinating because this was Hercules, the kneeler. And this was about giving humility before the gods. And it's at about 16 degrees of Sagittarius. And the first person that came to my mind was Colin Kaepernick, who was the first to take a knee during the national anthem during an NFL game. And I was like, man, that guy's got to have something conjoined this fixed star. And sure enough, his Saturn was at about 18 degrees of Sagittarius within a 3-degree orb of this Ras Al-Gethi, the kneeler. And he began his protest, his kneeling protest, just as his Saturn return was beginning. So he had that particular planet being activated and became famous for being a kneeler. So like I said, this is something that can be very literal. And I would very much encourage a study of fixed stars. And I'll try to do my best to incorporate that more and more into my forecasts here, because I think that it brings a whole nother layer of richness. In addition to when I learn more about the astronomical factors involved with precession and with how the constellations and fixed stars appear in the sky, I hope to bring that into my forecast as well, because I think that'll also begin to tie things together. So anyway, that's kind of what we're going to be seeing with Mars, is this kind of raw power, this raw anger, this desire to take action, to do something, but it's going to be constantly held in check by this retrograde Saturn conjoining Jupiter and Pluto. There's just some factor of limitation, of strong limitation, of potentially a corrupt system that is really limiting the amount of action that we are able to take, the amount of change and separation that we're able to enact. It's going to be a very frustrating energy, and this may lead to an outpouring of violence, but this too shall pass is something that I will say. Like, I think we're going to have to do the hard work, but recognize that we may not be able to do everything that we want to do yet, or we may not be able to create all the change that we are hoping for right away. These cycles of change are long term, and we're going to have to go through some of this stopping and starting energy, where we have people that are pushing forth new paradigms, new agendas, new shared belief systems. And then we are having a lot of times a pushback from the older systems, the old conservative system in the truest sense of the word, not necessarily political sense of the word, although you could make that assertion as well, where people are trying to preserve an old order. And to me, this summer, I would say, has a feeling of The Empire Strikes Back. I just have a feeling that this is like episode 5, where we had the uprising with the resistance, and now we see the powers that be are like trying to squash it. And I have a lot of trepidation about the experiences we're going to be having as a nation, in America in particular, and as a global community. But just to give you hope, like eventually we get the return of the Jedi, where the old order topples, and we may go through some pain, we may experience some losses. But I do think, I pray, and I hope that eventually righteousness and justice and equity will prevail. But we'll see. This is what we're tasked with right now. And with our pronoia, with our foreknowledge, we get to make some choices within this energy and within this experience that we're having. All right. So again, the dates, I'll just give you the date rundown. Mars is going to be in Aries from the 27th through the 6th, the 27th of June through the 6th of January 2021, an entire 6 months. It's going to retrograde on the 9th of September 2020. It's going to station direct on November 13th. And then we're going to have a perfection of the square to retrograde Saturn on the 24th of August. And then we're going to have another square when Mars is retrograde and Saturn is direct in the 29th of September. There will be one final square on the 13th of January 2021 from Taurus to Aquarius. So a different shift of energy. So we're not going to be completely out of the woods after this summer, but it's going to be in a little bit of a different area of life. All right. I got one more day to get through in these long form discussions. Okay. On Sunday, June the 28th, the moon is going to be moving through the sign of Libra and moving into its first quarter phase. So this is about, first quarter is when we have a square or a disharmony between the lights, and that was a position of challenge. Before the moon squares the sun, it will be making a trine to Venus at 5 degrees of Libra and Gemini at 1:34 a.m. And then at 4:15 a.m., it makes a square to the sun from 7 degrees of Libra to 7 degrees of Cancer. The only other the only other lunar aspect of the day is the moon will be squaring retrograde Mercury as well. So that's part of our conversation with our first quarter moon. And then Mars will be sextiling retrograde Saturn throughout the day at 6:58 a.m. from 0 degrees of Aries to 0 degrees of Aquarius. So let's unpack our day here, because it's gonna be a funky day, I think. So when we have a square aspect between these planets, right? And we've got a 90-degree angle. And squares are of the nature of Mars. So everything I just described with Mars, we can apply to the aspect and kind of the type of conversation that these planets are having. So the moon and, the planets that the moon is hosting are not really, they're not digging each other right now. So the sun and Mercury are hanging out in the moon's temple. And the moon is in the sign of Libra. The moon is asking for balance, for fairness, for justice, for equity, for peacemaking. But but the sun and Mercury are very concerned at this point with nurturing and resources with how we are feeding and how we are getting fed, with who we are including in the conversation. And all of these things are being opposed by Jupiter and Pluto, okay, in Capricorn, where we're really, this may be like trying to bring peace, but we have these really difficult conversations about who's in the in crowd and who isn't. So this may be a time where we're really needing to use our diplomatic skills to negotiate between those two polar extremes, okay? So ask yourself on Sunday the 28th during this first quarter phase, what is fair? How do I bring about equality, equity, justice, peace? How do we judge the heart against the weight of the feather, right? If you were entering the underworld, if you were at the end of your life here, how would you judge your actions? How would you judge the collective's actions? Are you holding on to old beliefs that don't serve you? Are you holding on to anger? Are you holding on to hatred? And are you perpetuating an old system? Those would be the questions that'll be bubbling to the surface with this this first quarter moon, as we try to bring something into existence in the lunar phase. With the Mars sextile with Saturn retrograde, we have, this one is kind of, this had a seed at the Mars Saturn conjunction at 0 degrees of Aquarius on March 31st of this year. So this is kind of a phase where we are kind of getting a, before those two planets were in aversion with one another, and now they are able to witness one another, okay? So there is the beginnings of a conversation between Mars and Saturn. Now, at first, that conversation may be somewhat productive, with it being a sextile. But I will warn you, things are going to go south pretty quickly when Saturn retrogrades back into Capricorn next week. So we may see some attempts at bringing some sort of consensus between our actions and demanding change and trying to take action, and how we're creating a new society like Saturn is trying to do in Aquarius. But once it retrogrades back into Capricorn, that's when we're really reactivating some of the power of the old order, where there may be a crackdown on some things. And I'm just saying this to warn you, because I really do think that we're going to start to experience some of the most challenging aspects that we have in a long time beginning next week. And I want you to prepare for those things. I want you to be prepared mentally, emotionally, maybe even physically, like with the, there could be disruptions to some of the resources that we assume that we will always have. Like when the water main broke, I went and stocked up on some bottled water, just so that if there was a problem again, that we would be able to flush our toilet or have drinking water. My good friend Ann Ortley is predicting some disruptions in the food supply chain and the delivery of food production over the course of the summer. So she's been advising people to stock up on some non-perishables. So I'm of the opinion, better safe than sorry. I don't think we should take this to an extreme where you just can't live your life anymore. Like we don't want to get into a period of hoarding like we did when we first experienced some of these hardships. But being a little bit prepared and having some foreknowledge, I don't think is a bad thing. Do it just in a balanced way, I would say. All right. Mars and Saturn combined can speak to disciplined action. They are both in their domiciles, so they have some equal strength, although Saturn is retrograde, which is sort of an accidental debility. But Saturn is in the overcoming position, so Saturn has the upper hand. So we may be seeing an ability for at least the next week or so to take more reasonable, disciplined action than we normally would be able to. This may be the last week that you have to do some stuff that feels productive before the shit hits the fan, okay? before you feel like you're stuck in the mud and it's much more difficult to go anywhere. And to be 100% honest with you, I have a feeling that for the last few weeks here, as everything's opened up and as I've really observed in my own community how cavalier people have been, we're going to experience a second wave of the coronavirus too. And I think it is almost a foregone conclusion that we will have to retrace our steps and go back into quarantine at some point this summer. I you know, I feel pretty confident saying that. And so get what you need to get done, but be safe about it and recognize that your movement may be more limited as we move forward into the summer. And try not to get too frustrated. It's just, this is part of the cycle, but be prepared for that. Okay. What else? When Mars and Saturn come together, sometimes Mars being action and Saturn being the quality of ignorance and fear and darkness, a lot of times we may be taking action based on our ananke and agnoia, based on our fear and our ignorance. And I think that it's very important to kind of be aware that you don't want to get consumed by your fear. Having a healthy amount of self-preservation is okay. But if we allow ourselves to get irrational and to take actions that are not focused, that's when we can really get into trouble. So if what I think that could happen is with Mars in this very volatile position, we may be lashing out against a very entrenched system that is going to do its best to clamp down and restore, quote unquote, order. Now, I don't think that order is going to last because we've got Pluto and Jupiter doing its thing there, trying to compost this old thing. But like I said, this is the Empire Strikes Back type of vibes over the next few months here. Okay. Well, sorry to leave you on that depressing note, but this too shall pass, right? This is something that we're going to have to get through it together. I think sometimes we have the dark night of the soul that we go through, whether it's as a community or as personally. And I think that we'll get through it. I think that if we stay asking good questions, if we take care of one another and try to think about what is good for the collective while keeping an eye out for our individual rights as well, and trying to balance those two things, that is going to leave us in good stead. Just recognize right now that the most supported actions are going to be the ones that are moving towards building a new paradigm. We're heading towards the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in the sign of Aquarius at the winter solstice. That's a very, very important moment, probably one of the most important moments that we've experienced in astrology for a very, very long time. And I mean that in like hundreds of years. So the energy that's going to be supported towards the end of the year is paradigm shift energy. And there will be people that will rebel against that due to their own selfish desires. But eventually we're going to have to find a way to live together as a society. And one of the things that Sam Reynolds talked about in his latest article was the new American Revolution is the fight for the rights of Black people and the rights of equality and creating a society that is more just for everyone. And this is also included with it economic equity also, not just for people of color, but for everyone as well. Because we've got a lot of reckoning that is happening on the financial and the resource level of the society that we're living on. We're going to have to deal with some of those questions, and we'll get through it. We'll get through it together. We'll get through it as a community, I hope, and hopefully keeping the lines of communication open and trying to find compromises where we can, and then discarding some of the old things that are really proving to not be functional at all. All right. Looking ahead to next week, the 29th through the 5th, on Tuesday, the 30th, we'll have our conjunction between retrograde Jupiter and retrograde Pluto at 24 degrees of Capricorn. So another peak moment I believe the first conjunction that we had with Jupiter and Pluto is when we really started to become aware of the severity of the coronavirus. We'll have a retrograde Mercury sextiling Uranus at 9 degrees of Cancer and Taurus. Then we have our Cazimi moment. We have our Mercury retrograde inferior conjunction going Cazimi at 9 degrees of Cancer, so a whole entire new Mercury cycle. On Wednesday, the 7th, on Wednesday, July 1st, 7-1, the Sun will make a sextile to Uranus, and Capricorn, Saturn retrograde will move back into Capricorn. It'll move into that position, third decan of Capricorn, to, you know, reevaluate and you know, take out the trash, basically, okay, to bring more contraction to those hierarchical structures. On Sunday, July 5th, we're building all this week to the full moon lunar eclipse at 13 degrees of Capricorn and Cancer. So again, we don't have to have it all figured out in these next coming weeks ahead. I would, if it were me, I would delay any major decisions over the next week or so, because all of the pieces have not been revealed yet. And once we're past this eclipse period, we're going to have a much better idea of what type of work is going to be required of us as a collective and personally. Okay. Just one little side note. On July 9th through the 13th, I will be at the Great Lakes Astrology Conference online. I'm going to be doing a lecture on tarot and the thema mundi and the relationship between that and the decanic relationships. My lecture will be on Friday, July the 10th at 10 a.m. So you can find more information on that at greatlakesastrology.com. The conference is from the 9th through the 13th. I believe also that weekend there will be the Queer Astrology Conference. So I wanted to give a shout out to that as well. I had a nice listener reach out to me and bring me to awareness of that. So, you know, check that out if that is, check that out as well. So if you could do both, I don't know. I know that there's only so much time to go around, but it's nice to be able to support these multiple movements that we have going on here. So that's what I've got for this week. If you are enjoying these videos, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe, share with your friends. There are a couple of donation links. There's a PayPal me and a Venmo account if you'd like to support my work. As always, the best way that you can support my work is reaching out to schedule a reading. Yeah, I hope that you're doing well this week. Hang in there. This too shall pass. We'll get through it together, and have a good summer so far, okay? We'll get through it. Peace, everyone.